And basically what we want to know for your purposes is that there is a difference between contacting ground personnel that are servicing the aircraft as opposed to contacting ATC ground, or air traffic control ground. You see, if we call ground to request a taxi clearance or a pushback and engine start clearance, that's a different ground that we're talking to, whereas if we were to call ground and request the connection or perhaps the removal of external power. So I want you to understand there's two grounds that we're talking about, particularly at the pushback phase or sequence, if you will, when we're at the gate, where the captain is talking cockpit to ground. That means cockpit to ground, down to the personnel that are hooked up with a headset microphone at the interphone jack that is typically in the nose section of the airplane. This is a person that drives the tug, the tow bar, as I mentioned. This is also typically the people that will load bags and also connect ground power, deconnect it, perhaps, or deselect it, remove external air, connect external air, and what have you, right? So cockpit to ground at the gate is entirely the captain. Aircraft talking to ground, ATC, is generally the first officer, okay? Because typically, getting a little bit into CRM now, on the ground, the captain is always the pilot flying, and the first officer is always the pilot monitoring. That's right, first officer, even if it's your leg to fly, it becomes your flight, or you become, rather, moreover, the pilot flying, better said, you become the pilot flying when the aircraft is given to you by the captain. So the captain has to say, you have control, which typically happens when we line up on the runway, and the captain, prior to that point, is taxiing the airplane and is considered the pilot flying. So you remain the pilot monitoring until the appropriate time, which is typically lined up on the runway where we transfer control. Now, because of that delegation of tasks, right, cockpit to ground is always the pilot flying, or typically really the captain at the gate, and the pilot monitoring's role will be to talk via ATC. All right, so now hopefully you understand there's a very clear division between talking to ground personnel downstairs, and by downstairs I mean down on ground level, right below the cockpit, and talking to ATC ground. Cockpit to ground is what we will say to get their attention, and if they're trying to get our attention, they're going to say ground to cockpit. So basically where I'm at and where I'm trying to communicate, from the cockpit to the ground, or from the ground up to the cockpit.